April 6, 1954. The mountains of northern Vietnam trembled under the weight of history. At 14,000 feet above the valley of Dien Bien Phu, the twin engines of a Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar thundered through air thick with monsoon humidity and the acrid smoke of artillery fire. Inside the cargo hold, James B. McGovern, Jr., known to his fellow pilots as Earthquake Magoon, gripped the controls with hands that had guided aircraft across 3 continents and through storms that would have grounded lesser men. Below him, the French fortress burned like a wound in the earth, surrounded by trenches that snaked through the jungle like veins of desperation. The cockpit vibrated with mechanical rhythm, filled with the smell of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic taste of fear that clung to every surface. Each flight over this cursed valley carried tons of ammunition, rice, and medical supplies into the void, hoping against mathematics that the cargo would fall within French lines rather than into the hands of General Giap's artillery crews, who waited with the patience of spiders in their mountain positions. The irony of this moment stretched back through weeks of bureaucratic contempt and military miscalculation. In the opulent halls of the French colonial administration in Hanoi, where ceiling fans turned lazily above mahogany desks and crystal decanters held cognac that had travelled further than most French soldiers would ever venture, a decorated colonel had dismissed the American proposal with a wave of his white-gloved hand. "Ils ne connaissent pas la guerre," he had declared to his staff, the words carrying the weight of centuries of European military tradition. "They do not know war." The colonel's certainty was absolute. These American civilian contractors with their ungainly cargo planes and cowboy attitudes could never comprehend the sophisticated dance of modern warfare that France had perfected through 2 world wars and countless colonial campaigns. But reality had already begun to erode such confidence. The French Union forces were hemorrhaging pilots faster than the training schools in Toulouse could replace them, and the Armée de l'Air had lost so many transport aircraft that supply runs to isolated garrisons had become acts of desperation rather than routine logistics. Washington had responded with typical American pragmatism. If the French needed help, the Central Intelligence Agency would provide it, but with plausible deniability woven into every contract and mission briefing. The operation received the cryptic designation Condor, and Civil Air Transport, a CIA proprietary airline that officially existed only on Taiwanese registration papers, began recruiting pilots who understood that their government would disavow their existence if they were captured or killed. The C-119 flying boxcar itself embodied the technological contradictions that would define America's approach to Southeast Asian warfare for the next 2 decades. Designed originally as a cargo hauler for the peacetime economy, the aircraft had been pressed into military service through sheer necessity rather than optimal engineering. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R4360 Wasp major engines generated 3,500 horsepower each, enough to lift 27,000 pounds of supplies into the thin air above tropical mountains. But this power came at the cost of speed and maneuverability. The aircraft's maximum velocity of 281 miles per hour made it a lumbering target for ground-based anti-aircraft systems, while its service ceiling of 24,000 feet meant that pilots had to choose between oxygen-starved high-altitude flights that reduced cargo capacity and low-level approaches that exposed them to small arms fire. The cargo bay, designed for palletized freight and peaceful landings on prepared airstrips, had been hastily modified with roller systems that could push supply bundles out the rear cargo doors, while the aircraft maintained forward speed. Each bundle weighed between 500 and 1,200 pounds, packed with French 75mm artillery shells, medical morphine, bags of rice, and ammunition for the MS-36 rifles that French paratroopers carried into battle. The navigation systems relied on radio beacons that the Viet Minh had learned to jam or redirect, forcing pilots to navigate by visual landmarks in weather conditions that could shift from crystal visibility to impenetrable cloud cover in minutes. Weather reconnaissance data, when it existed at all, came from French meteorological stations that were often overrun or abandoned, leaving American pilots to interpret wind patterns and storm systems with the intuition of merchant mariners rather than the precision instruments of modern aviation. The first fracture in this delicate operation occurred during the pre-dawn hours of May 2nd, when McGovern's aircraft encountered what the mission logs euphemistically recorded as unexpected ground fire intensity. The reality was far more violent and personally devastating. As the C-119 descended through 8,000 feet on approach to Drop Zone Alpha, a circular clearing marked by white panels that French engineers had positioned with mathematical precision, the aircraft suddenly lurched, as if struck by an invisible hammer. The port engine cowling erupted in orange flame and black smoke, while hydraulic fluid began spraying across the cockpit windows in patterns that looked like abstract art painted in terror. McGovern's co-pilot, Wallace Buford, later reported that the pilot's first words were not profanity or panic, but a calm assessment delivered in the tone of a flight instructor correcting a student's error. "Looks like Charlie got our range." The radio crackled with urgent French voices, reporting that Viet Minh artillery observers had triangulated the aircraft's approach pattern and were walking their fire up the flight path with mechanical precision. Each explosion created a wall of shrapnel that could shred aluminum skin and sever control cable, while the concussion waves buffeted the aircraft like a child's toy in a hurricane. McGovern fought the controls as the C-119 began to porpoise, nose up, nose down, in the classic pattern of an aircraft losing hydraulic pressure to its elevator. The cargo bundles, improperly secured in the rush to launch the mission, began sliding forward in the bay, shifting the aircraft's center of gravity beyond the limits that even an experienced pilot could compensate for through manual control. Below them, the French garrison's radio operator transmitted in increasingly desperate tones, "Les blessés, ils vont mourir sans munitions." The wounded, they will die without ammunition. The moral weight of this transmission settled over the cockpit like a physical force, because every man aboard understood that aborting the mission meant condemning French soldiers, men with names, families, and hopes, to death by starvation or enemy action. The transformation that occurred in McGovern's thinking during those crucial seconds would later be studied by military psychologists as an example of combat decision-making under extreme stress. According to Buford's debriefing testimony, which remained classified until 1975, the pilot's demeanor shifted from mechanical professionalism to something approaching religious resolve. McGovern had been flying dangerous missions for nearly 3 years, first supporting Chinese nationalist forces during their retreat to Taiwan, then conducting supply runs to isolated French outposts throughout Indochina. But this moment represented his first direct confrontation with the philosophical implications of his work. He was no longer simply a contractor delivering cargo for payment. He had become a combatant in an ideological war where individual choices carried the weight of civilizational struggle. The French forces trapped in the valley below represented more than military units. They embodied the Western democratic tradition that was being challenged by communist expansion throughout Asia. McGovern's decision to continue the approach despite the mechanical failures and ground fire intensity reflected not reckless heroism, but calculated moral reasoning. He understood that his aircraft was damaged beyond safe operation, that his crew's survival depended on immediate withdrawal to a secure airfield, and that the probability of successful cargo delivery had dropped to nearly zero. But he also understood that abandoning the mission would represent a surrender to forces that viewed human life as expendable in service of political ideology. The radio continued to broadcast French voices pleading for ammunition and medical supplies, each transmission a reminder that abstract geopolitical calculations translated into concrete human suffering for men whose only crime was following orders from governments that had underestimated their enemies' determination and tactical sophistication. As the damaged C-1119 lined up for its final approach to the drop zone, McGovern initiated a series of tactical adaptations that demonstrated the kind of innovation under pressure that would later characterize American military operations throughout Southeast Asia. With hydraulic pressure failing and the port engine producing more smoke than thrust, he began using differential power settings on the starboard engine to control the aircraft's attitude and direction. The technique, known to test pilots as flying on the edge of the envelope, required constant manipulation of throttle, rudder, and elevator trim to maintain controlled flight. McGovern reduced airspeed to just above stalling velocity, approximately 95 knots indicated airspeed, to extend the time over the target zone and increase the probability that cargo bundles would land within the French perimeter. This decision exposed the aircraft to ground fire for extended periods, but it also maximized the mission's humanitarian impact by ensuring that precious ammunition and medical supplies reached the soldiers who desperately needed them. The cargo master, Master Sergeant Henry Laborde, began pushing bundles out the rear cargo door with mechanical precision, each package trailing a white parachute that bloomed like a flower against the dark green jungle canopy. French observers on the ground later reported that the supply drop was the most accurate they had witnessed during the entire siege, with nearly 70% of the bundles landing within friendly lines, a success rate that normal operations achieved only under optimal weather and tactical conditions. But this accuracy came at the cost of predictability, as Viet Minh artillery observers were able to track the aircraft's flight path and concentrate their fire with devastating effect. The radio intercepts that were declassified in 1995 revealed that General Giap's artillery commanders had specifically targeted American supply flights as a means of demonstrating that Western technological superiority could be defeated by disciplined infantry tactics and accurate indirect fire. The mechanical rhythm of successful cargo delivery created an almost hypnotic atmosphere in the cockpit, where McGovern and his crew fell into the focused concentration that combat pilots describe as being in the zone. Each bundle that cleared the aircraft reduced weight and improved performance, allowing McGovern to maintain altitude despite the failing engine and damaged control surface. The French radio operators provided continuous updates on cargo recovery, their voices carrying a mixture of gratitude and desperation that reminded the American crew why their mission mattered beyond abstract strategic considerations. Bundle 7 recovered, medical supplies intact, morphine distribution commenced immediately. These transmissions created a feedback loop of purpose that sustained the crew's morale, even as their tactical situation deteriorated with each passing minute. The Viet Minh anti-aircraft fire intensified as enemy observers realized that the American aircraft was maintaining a predictable flight pattern, and the radio began crackling with warnings from French spotters who could see muzzle flashes and smoke trails from enemy positions in the surrounding hills. McGovern acknowledged these warnings with brief transmissions that revealed his understanding of the tactical reality. Roger. Ground fire observed. Continuing approach. Mission completion priority. This phrase, mission completion priority, would later be incorporated into CIA training manual as an example of the psychological commitment required for successful covert operations in hostile environment. The concept embodied a fundamental principle of American involvement in Southeast Asia, that technological superiority and individual courage could overcome numerical disadvantages and environmental challenges, but only if operators were willing to accept personal risk in service of broader strategic objectives. At 14:47 hours local time, as recorded by French artillery observers whose chronometers were synchronized with Paris meridian time, the tactical situation shifted from manageable crisis to catastrophic failure in the span of 18 seconds. A direct hit from a Soviet-manufactured 37mm anti-aircraft shell penetrated the C-119's starboard engine cowling and detonated inside the power section, creating an explosion that could be heard above the ambient noise of battle throughout the valley. The aircraft's electrical system failed immediately, plunging the cockpit into the strange twilight of emergency lighting, while cutting off all radio communication with French ground controllers and other aircraft in the area. McGovern's voice, transmitted on the aircraft's internal communication system before the electrical failure, was recorded by the flight engineer's backup battery-powered equipment. "Hold tight, boys. We're going in hard. Prepare for impact." The words carried no trace of panic or regret, only the professional acknowledgement of aerodynamic reality that every pilot trained to recognize. With both engines either destroyed or producing insufficient power for controlled flight, the C-119 entered what aviation manuals describe as an unrecoverable descent profile, a condition where gravitational force exceeds the aircraft's ability to generate lift through forward motion and control surface manipulation. McGovern's final flight control input, reconstructed from wreckage analysis conducted by French recovery team, demonstrated textbook emergency procedures executed with precision that would have impressed flight instructors at any aviation training facility. He maintained the aircraft's nose-up attitude to reduce vertical descent rate, used differential aileron input to prevent the aircraft from entering a fatal spin, and attempted to direct the inevitable impact toward an area where the explosion would not endanger French defensive positions. The crash site analysis, conducted jointly by French military engineers and CIA technical specialists, revealed details about the final moments that transformed a supply mission into a defining moment of American involvement in Southeast Asian warfare. The C-119 struck the northeastern slope of Hill 506, approximately 1,200 meters from the intended drop zone, at an estimated impact velocity of 180 kilometers per hour. The aircraft's aluminum structure, designed for pressurized flight rather than ground impact, disintegrated upon contact with the rocky terrain, scattering debris across a 300-meter radius that included personal effects, aircraft components, and fragments of the final supply bundles that McGovern had died attempting to deliver. The fuel explosion that followed created a column of black smoke that rose to nearly 3,000 meters altitude, visible to observers throughout the valley, and providing an unintended navigation reference for subsequent air operations. French recovery teams, operating under covering fire from paratroop units, reached the crash site within 4 hours and confirmed that none of the crew had survived the impact. McGovern's body was found still strapped into the pilot's seat, his hands positioned on the control yoke in the attitude of a pilot attempting to maintain aircraft control during an emergency landing. The co-pilot, Wallace Buford, had been thrown clear of the cockpit during the breakup sequence, while the cargo master and flight engineer were found in the wreckage of the cargo, apparently killed instantly when the aircraft's structure failed. Personal effects recovered from the site included McGovern's flight logbook, which contained entries dating back to his service with the Flying Tigers during World War II, and a letter from his wife in which she expressed concern about the increasing danger of his missions and urged him to consider returning to civilian aviation within the United States. The bureaucratic aftermath of McGovern's death revealed the complex legal and political frameworks that surrounded covert American operations during the early Cold War period. CIA administrative records, declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests filed during the 1980s, showed that McGovern's official status was listed as civilian contractor engaged in humanitarian supply operations, a designation that provided legal protection for both the agency and the United States government if his activities became subject to international scrutiny. His next of kin received death benefits calculated according to standard life insurance policies rather than military compensation, and his name was not included in official casualty reports submitted to Congress or the Department of Defense. This bureaucratic invisibility served multiple purposes. It maintained the fiction that American involvement in Indochina was limited to advisory and humanitarian roles. It protected the CIA's cover arrangements with civil air transport, and it avoided creating congressional pressure for expanded military intervention at a time when the Eisenhower administration was still formulating its policy towards Southeast Asian conflict. But the human cost of this administrative discretion was profound, as McGovern's sacrifice remained officially unacknowledged for nearly 2 decades, while other pilots continued flying similar missions under identical legal and operational constraints. The pattern established by his death, American personnel dying in combat while their government maintained plausible deniability, would become a defining characteristic of United States involvement in Southeast Asia throughout the 1950s and 1960s, creating a shadow war where individual courage and sacrifice occurred within a framework of institutional dishonesty and strategic ambiguity. French military historians have argued that McGovern's final mission represented a turning point not only in American involvement, but in the broader trajectory of Western colonialism in Southeast Asia. The accuracy of his final supply drop, achieved at the cost of his life and his crew's lives, provided French defenders with enough ammunition to sustain their resistance for an additional 48 hours, time that allowed for the evacuation of wounded personnel and the destruction of classified documents before the garrison's final surrender. But more significantly, the image of an American pilot dying to support European colonial forces created a psychological precedent that would influence American strategic thinking for the remainder of the Indochina conflict. McGovern's death demonstrated that the United States could not maintain the role of distant supporter without eventually becoming a direct participant, because humanitarian missions and military operations were ultimately indistinguishable in the context of guerrilla warfare, where civilian populations and combatants coexisted in the same geographical space. The Viet Minh forces that shot down his aircraft made no distinction between French military personnel and American contractors, viewing both as representatives of Western imperialism that needed to be expelled from Southeast Asia, regardless of the legal technicalities that Washington used to justify its involvement. This tactical reality forced American policymakers to confront the fundamental contradiction in their approach. They wanted to influence the outcome of the Indochina conflict without accepting the political and military consequences of intervention, but modern warfare made such selective engagement impossible to sustain over extended periods. The strategic implications of Operation Condor extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation at Dien Bien Phu establishing patterns of covert operation and plausible deniability that would define American foreign policy throughout the Cold War era. The lessons learned from McGovern's death influenced the CIA's subsequent development of Air America, the proprietary airline that would conduct supply missions, personnel transport, and psychological operations throughout Southeast Asia for the next 20 years. The operational procedures refined during the Dien Bien Phu siege, including nighttime navigation techniques, cargo delivery methods, and emergency protocols, became standard training curriculum for pilots recruited to support American objectives in Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam. The bureaucratic structures created to maintain legal separation between government policy and contractor operations provided a template for similar arrangements in Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East, where American interests required military support without official acknowledgement. But perhaps most significantly, McGovern's sacrifice established the moral framework that would justify expanded American involvement in Vietnam throughout the 1960s. His death proved that communist forces would kill Americans regardless of their official status or humanitarian mission, creating a moral obligation for the United States government to protect its citizens and advance its interests through whatever means necessary. This reasoning would eventually support the deployment of combat advisors, then regular military units, and finally, the massive escalation that characterized the Vietnam War during the Johnson administration. The psychological impact of losing the first American in Vietnam combat extended throughout the small community of pilots and support personnel who conducted covert operations for the CIA during the 1950s. McGovern had been widely respected, not only for his technical flying skills, but for his personal integrity and his ability to maintain morale during the most dangerous missions. His death created a sense of personal loss that went beyond professional concerns, because it demonstrated that even the most experienced and careful pilots could not overcome the fundamental vulnerability of aircraft operating in hostile environments without air superiority or comprehensive intelligence support. The surviving civil air transport pilots began developing informal protocols for psychological support and risk assessment that would eventually influence official military policies regarding combat stress and crew rotation. They created memorial funds for the families of killed personnel, established communication networks to maintain contact with crew members who returned to civilian life, and developed training programs that emphasized survival skills and emergency procedures based on lessons learned from fatal accidents. These grassroots initiatives reflected the esprit de corps that sustained covert aviation operations despite the official neglect and bureaucratic indifference that characterized government policy toward contractor personnel. The pilots understood that they were serving American strategic interests under conditions where their government could not officially acknowledge their service or sacrifice, but they also understood that their personal bonds with each other provided the only reliable source of support and recognition for their contributions to the broader struggle against communist expansion. As the siege of Dien Bien Phu entered its final phase during the first week of May 1954, the broader implications of American involvement became increasingly apparent to policymakers in Washington, who had initially viewed covert support as a low-risk method of advancing strategic objectives. The death of McGovern and his crew forced the Eisenhower administration to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between tactical success and strategic commitment that would remain unresolved throughout the subsequent decades of American involvement in Southeast. Military planners began to understand that air mobility operations, even when conducted by civilian contractors under humanitarian cover, constituted a form of combat intervention that enemy forces would treat as acts of war regardless of legal technicalities or diplomatic disclaimers. Intelligence analysts recognized that the Viet Minh's ability to shoot down American aircraft demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication and strategic coordination that challenged prevailing assumptions about guerrilla warfare capabilities in developing nations. Political advisors warned that public revelation of American casualties in Indochina could create congressional pressure for either complete withdrawal or massive escalation, both of which would undermine the administration's preferred policy of limited engagement and graduated response. These concerns led to increased emphasis on operational security and plausible deniability, but they also established the precedent for using military force to support political objectives while denying the logical consequences of such action. The technological lessons learned from McGovern's final mission influenced aircraft design and operational procedures throughout the 1950s and 1960s, as the CIA and later the Defense Department sought to develop aviation systems better suited to counterinsurgency operations in tropical environments. The C-119's vulnerability to small arms and light anti-aircraft fire led to interest in faster, more maneuverable aircraft that could complete supply missions with reduced exposure time over hostile territory. The navigation challenges encountered during night operations in monsoon weather conditions prompted research into improved radio beacon systems, radar altimeters, and eventually satellite-based navigation technologies that would not depend on ground-based infrastructure subject to enemy interference or destruction. The cargo delivery difficulties experienced with conventional parachute systems led to development of low-altitude extraction methods, precision-guided munitions, and eventually helicopter-based logistics that could provide greater accuracy and flexibility than fixed-wing aircraft operating from high altitude. But perhaps most significantly, the crew coordination and emergency response procedures developed through analysis of the crash contributed to improved training programs that emphasized decision-making under stress, risk assessment in degraded conditions, and the psychological factors that influenced pilot performance during extended combat operations. These technical and procedural innovations provided the foundation for the massive air mobility campaigns that characterized American military operations in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, demonstrating how individual tactical failures could generate systemic improvement that enhanced overall operational effectiveness. The diplomatic consequences of American casualties at Dien Bien Phu extended throughout the international community as allies and adversaries alike sought to understand the implications of direct American involvement in what had previously been characterized as a French colonial conflict. British intelligence services, maintaining close cooperation with their American counterparts, despite public skepticism about intervention in Indochina, began developing their own contingency plans for supporting Western interests in Southeast Asia if French resistance collapsed entirely. Soviet analysts, working with incomplete information but accurate intuition, recognized that American casualties would create political pressure for either escalation or withdrawal, both of which could be exploited to advance communist strategic objectives throughout the region. Chinese military advisors supporting the Viet Minh understood that killing American personnel would demonstrate the vulnerability of Western technological superiority when confronted by disciplined guerrilla forces operating in favorable terrain with popular support. The North Vietnamese leadership, led by Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, viewed McGovern's death as confirmation that their strategy of prolonged resistance could eventually force even the most powerful Western nations to abandon their colonial ally and accept communist victory through attrition rather than decisive battle. These international perceptions established expectations and assumptions that would influence policy decisions throughout the subsequent 2 decades of conflict, as each side sought to achieve psychological and political objectives through military action, while avoiding the costs and risks associated with total commitment to victory or defeat. Years later, when Pentagon historians attempted to establish a comprehensive chronology of American involvement in Southeast Asia, McGovern's death would be officially recognized as the first American combat fatality of what became known as the Vietnam War. But this posthumous acknowledgement could not address the fundamental contradiction between the individual courage and sacrifice demonstrated by men like McGovern and the institutional dishonesty that characterized official policy toward their service. The CIA pilots who conducted covert operations throughout Southeast Asia during the 1950s and 1960s understood that their government valued their contributions but could not publicly acknowledge their existence, creating a parallel structure of recognition and that operated independently of normal military and civilian institutions. They developed their own traditions of commemoration and remembrance, their own networks of mutual support and professional development, and their own standards of conduct and performance that reflected the unique challenges of serving American interests under conditions where normal legal and bureaucratic protections did not apply. The memorial services held for McGovern and his crew, conducted without official sanction or media coverage, established precedents for honoring fallen personnel that would be repeated throughout the covert wars of the Cold War era, creating an invisible military tradition that paralleled but remained separate from the acknowledged sacrifices of conventional armed forces. The weather on the morning of May 7, 1954, dawned clear and humid over the valley where McGovern's aircraft had crashed, allowing French recovery teams to complete their grim work of collecting human remains and classified materials from the wreckage site. The aluminum fragments that littered the hillside caught the early sunlight like scattered mirrors, creating brief flashes of reflection that reminded observers of the aircraft's final moments when it had burned like a fallen star against the green jungle canopy. Vietnamese peasants from nearby villages, operating under instructions from Viet Minh political officers, had already begun salvaging useful materials from the crash site: pieces of aluminum sheeting for roofing repair, lengths of electrical cable for village infrastructure projects, and fragments of parachute silk that could be sewn into clothing or household goods. This peaceful scavenging activity, conducted within hours of violent combat, illustrated the complex relationship between warfare and civilian life in Southeast Asia, where military technology and human necessity intersected in ways that Western strategic planners rarely considered when designing their campaigns and operations. The French soldiers who witnessed this salvage activity understood that they were observing a cultural response to conflict that would persist long after the political and military objectives of the war had been resolved through negotiation or victory, because the practical needs of Vietnamese families would continue regardless of which government controlled their territory or which ideology dominated their political system. The final radio transmission from French forces at Dien Bien Phu, broadcast at 17:30 hours on May 7th, included a brief mention of the American crew that had died attempting to supply the garrison. "We remember the Americans who fell helping us. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten." But official French military records, compiled for submission to the government in Paris and Allied intelligence services, made no reference to CIA involvement or American casualty, maintaining the fiction that all supply operations had been conducted by French military personnel, using French aircraft and equipment. This bureaucratic erasure of McGovern's contribution reflected the broader pattern of institutional dishonesty that characterized Western policy towards Southeast Asia during the 1950s, where individual courage and sacrifice were systematically hidden from public view to maintain political flexibility and strategic ambiguity. The families of the killed airmen received standard death benefits and brief letters of condolence that provided no details about the circumstances of their loss or the strategic importance of their mission, leaving them to construct their own understanding of why their husbands and sons had died in a remote corner of Asia that few Americans could locate on a map. This personal cost of covert operations, the inability of families to understand or commemorate their losses within normal social and cultural frameworks, would become one of the most corrosive aspects of American involvement in Southeast Asia, creating resentment and suspicion that would influence public attitudes toward government policy throughout the subsequent decades of conflict. In the deeper historical context, McGovern's death marked the moment when American strategic ambitions in Southeast Asia began to require blood payment rather than simply diplomatic maneuvering or economic aid. The transition from advisor to combatant, from supporter to participant, occurred not through presidential decision or congressional declaration, but through the cumulative effect of individual choices made by men like McGovern, who found themselves confronting moral obligations that transcended their official instructions and legal status. His decision to continue the supply mission despite mechanical failure and enemy fire represented the kind of personal commitment that American strategic doctrine assumed but rarely acknowledged: the willingness of individual Americans to risk their lives for abstract principles and distant allies, even when their own government could not publicly support or recognize their sacrifice. This pattern of unofficial heroism and official denial would characterize American involvement in Southeast Asia for the next 2 decades, creating a shadow history of covert operations, classified casualties, and unacknowledged service that paralleled but remained separate from the public narrative of American foreign policy during the Cold War era. The psychological and moral costs of this institutional schizophrenia would eventually contribute to the broader crisis of confidence in government that characterized American politics during the 1960s and 1970s, as the families of killed servicemen and the veterans of covert operations began to demand public acknowledgement of their contributions and sacrifices. The jungle that witnessed McGovern's final moments has since reclaimed much of the battlefield where French colonialism died and American involvement began, but the deeper implications of his sacrifice continue to influence strategic thinking about intervention, escalation, and the relationship between tactical success and strategic commitment. Military historians studying the transition from French to American responsibility for Southeast Asian security have identified his death as a crucial precedent that established both the operational methods and the moral justifications that would support expanded American involvement throughout the 1960s. The CIA's success in conducting covert air operations despite the loss of personnel and aircraft demonstrated that American technological capabilities could be effectively deployed in support of Allied forces, even under adverse conditions, encouraging policymakers to view military assistance as a viable alternative to diplomatic negotiation or strategic withdrawal. But the human cost of such operations, symbolized by McGovern's death and the deaths of his crew, also established expectations about American willingness to sacrifice lives in defense of strategic interests that would eventually require massive escalation to sustain credibly. The logic of graduated response and measured commitment, attractive to planners who sought to manage risks and control costs, proved incompatible with the reality of modern warfare, where enemy forces made no distinction between official combatant and unofficial participant, forcing American decision-makers to choose between acknowledging their full commitment or accepting the moral consequences of denying support to personnel who had risked their lives in service of American objectives. Today, visitors to the valley of Dien Bien Phu will find few traces of the battle that ended French rule in Southeast Asia and began the American era of involvement in Vietnamese affairs. The climate has proven more durable than human memory, with monsoon rains and tropical vegetation, gradually erasing the physical evidence of combat while preserving the essential conditions that made the conflict so difficult for Western forces to understand and resolve. Local guides, many of them descendants of the Viet Minh fighters who shot down McGovern's aircraft, can still point to the approximate location where the C-119 crashed, but they remember the event not as the death of the first American in Vietnam, but as one small victory in a much larger struggle for national independence and cultural survival. This difference in historical perspective reflects the fundamental asymmetry that characterized American involvement in Southeast Asia throughout the Cold War era. While American policymakers viewed each engagement as part of a global ideological competition with clearly defined strategic objectives, Vietnamese participants understood the conflict as an existential struggle where compromise and negotiation were impossible because the survival of their society and culture was at stake. McGovern's death, heroic by American standards and tactically insignificant by Vietnamese measures, illustrated the incompatible worldview that would make peaceful resolution of the conflict impossible despite decades of diplomatic effort and military escalation. The metal fragments of McGovern's aircraft, now rusted beyond recognition and scattered through soil that has been cultivated by rice farmers for decades, serve as an inadvertent memorial to the broader tragedy of American involvement in Southeast Asia, a conflict where individual courage and institutional wisdom operated at cross purposes, where tactical innovations could not overcome strategic misconceptions, and where the willingness to sacrifice lives could not substitute for the political will to acknowledge the full implications of military commitment. His final radio transmission, "Hold tight, boys," has become part of the unofficial folklore of covert aviation operations, passed down through generations of pilots who understood that their service required not only technical skill and physical courage, but also the psychological resilience to accept death without public recognition or official acknowledgement. The phrase embodies the stoic professionalism that sustained American covert operations throughout the Cold War, but it also reflects the moral isolation that characterized personnel who served their country's interests while being denied their country's official support and protection. In this sense, McGovern's death prefigured not only the tactical pattern, but also the psychological and political costs that would define American involvement in Vietnam for the next 20 years, establishing precedents for sacrifice without victory, commitment without acknowledgement, and service without recognition that would ultimately contribute to the broader crisis of confidence in American institutions that characterize the post-war. History is not made of victories. It's made of voices that refuse to disappear. What should we cover next? Subscribe and share your thoughts on this video. Your feedback and support are immensely valuable and help me keep improving the content.